Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, will be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nikkel Schroeder.
Randy Nikkel Schroeder is the author of Arctic Smoke, Crooked Timber, and over 50 published short stories. In his spare time, he is professor of English, languages, and cultures at Mount Royal University. You can find more of his work at randynickelschroeder.com.
A point of interest about this interview that sets it apart from our other interviews is that the person we're speaking with is also the composer of our podcast theme music. So that's kind of fun. Randy and I have known each other a long time. I want to say 15 years now. You've probably read more books and essays on writing craft than anyone that I know. Books that include both theory and practice, books about screenwriting and prose. So as a kind of broad opening topic, what are some of the evergreen pieces of advice or information that you've noticed arising time and again? Whether or not you agree with them is another question.
I think it sort of depends on how we think of story, right? So most of the books that you're referencing there, actually I would say all of them, for lack of a better term, are from the Western tradition, right? They probably start somewhere with Aristotle's Poetics and then reflect the whole couple of millennia of development since then. So for me anyway, the evergreen aspects of, I guess what we'll just call quote unquote Western storytelling are, I usually say, agency, causality, and temporality. So fancy words, sound like a professor. But all I mean by that is the characters have to have at least a minimal level of agency. So they're usually thought of as individuals, and individuals who can make meaningful choices, or put another way, can produce meaningful consequences in their world for which they can be held responsible, right? Either celebrated for the consequences they produce or not celebrated, right? Blamed. So that's agency. And the type of agency is usually understood to be causal in a fairly linear way, right? So you have a character who has, the familiar motivation or stakes or desires or whatever, and those produce in a very linear fashion the choices the character makes, and then those in turn produce in a very linear fashion the consequences, right? Or you could even break it down and say the choice causes the action and the action causes the consequence. And then the sort of less immediately graspable idea of temporality simply means that causal chain going from agency to consequence happens in linear time. So you can chop the time up and present it out of order. But from the character's POV, it always happens in order. And I always like to point out that none of those things may be true in real life, but they seem true to so many of us. And I would say that's because we think so fully in narrative. But that's another question entirely.
Today, Miriam and I were talking yesterday about this topic of agency, because it's, of course, something you and I have returned to a lot when we talk about certain forms of noir fiction, certain forms of horror fiction, that this question of agency does become muddier, that there is maybe a cosmic agent or an invisible agent that appears to be moving the actions in a story. Like if you think of someone like Thomas Ligotti or even Jim Thompson, it seems that there is sort of this invisible puppeteer who is maneuvering the characters, which kind of goes against some of those dictates of narrative. But I also see you playing with some of those ideas in your own fiction. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but certainly in your second novel, your noir novel, you're engaging with these ideas of agency. So I guess a question I have for you is, do you find it emancipatory to write characters whose agency is contested in that way? Does it present a challenge? Maybe a bit of both. Just maybe talking about the topic of agency in writing could be interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. It's a challenge from a number of different perspectives. it's a formal challenge. So it's a challenge in terms of actual craft, because as your previous question drew out, the craft is so based on agency. But it's also a challenge from the point of view of getting people to read it, because as you point out, there are only a few genres that can, I guess, get away with tinkering with agency, and they happen to be certain forms of especially cosmic horror and noir, I think. And I would also add probably some forms of comedy. So yeah, one of the ways to work with that challenge is to work in the appropriate genre. And I've kind of chosen noir, as you say, for now. But the challenge from a formal perspective is, I mean, I love it. It's an interesting challenge. I think about it a lot, and I'm not sure I've drawn any firm conclusions as to how to do it. But some of the options, I think, would be to, for example, have a POV character, a point of view character who thinks they have agency and who don't. So you can create that disjunction. And then, of course, you come up with formal questions like, well, do they at some point realize that they don't have agency? Or is it the type of tragedy where they just never realize it and keep going and whatever? Another formal idea that I've played with, and it's a really tricky one, I'm not sure I have a handle on it, but is to try and create characters, like main characters from the very beginning, who have a kind of distributive agency, meaning that their choices are not 100% their own, right? I mean, whether that's stuff they've downloaded from parents or, backstory stuff, I guess would be the common way to do that. But it's hard to do because then it's less linear, right? And it's less simple. And you got to figure out ways to convey meaningfully to readers that agency is not unidirectional and it doesn't come from a single character's point of view or a single character's backstory or a single character's motivation. Tough to do, and I'm not sure I know how to do it. would have been easier in the 70s, right? When you had writers like Pynchon who were doing it, I think anyway, doing it all the time, and apparently people were reading it.
I'm curious about your process for creating and developing characters, the classic, like, coming up with what a character wants versus what they need, or do you believe in that? I've had creative writing instructors who've told us to think very deeply about every little aspect of character, what their apartment looks like, what their surname means in terms of lineage. But of course, when you're a writer, you have to stop somewhere to keep the ball rolling. So I'm just curious what your process for character development is.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And, as writers, we talk about it all the time, right? So I'd say, first of all, I do not personally understand how one can create a narrative without first figuring out who the character is. So I've never understood, even slightly, how one could come up with a plot first and then populate it with characters. That just doesn't make any sense to me at all. So, in the traditional lineage, for me anyway, I always have to start with at least one POV character. And, the classic idea is what they want, whether they are capable of getting what they want, whether they have the resources, and what stands in the way of what they want. Very traditional, I guess you could even say, genre advice. But for me, I don't, when I teach it and when I do it, character craft, I don't have any interest in, extraneous details that aren't immediately relevant to the kinds of choices a character would make, right? Because I see plot as developing organically out of the choices characters make. So if a character's hair color or surname or house or whatever street they live on doesn't have a clearly relevant bearing on what kind of choices they'd make, I always teach to just leave that stuff alone. I mean, unless you're really interested in it and it kind of gets you in the mood or gets your juices flowing. And it's always a weird thing in a creative writing class, at least in my experience, because a lot of people, usually the majority, say, but I have to know the character, right? I understand that I think it's a type of character craft that's sometimes called character possession. I think roughly analogous to certain acting techniques where you stay in character. But for me, it doesn't make any sense. I don't, like writers will ask me, do you miss your characters after, you're finished writing? And I'm like, no, because they're not real people. They're composites of craft elements. And, if they work, they have that magical capacity to engage the sense of empathy and identification in readers. But I don't know, for me, I don't know them, quote unquote. Characters are not people, right?
characters are the engines of story, are the engines of narrative, so to speak. But we're also talking a little bit about the role of genre when we think about characters. Another sort of macro level question I had for you is, how important is it to you when you're entering a writing project to think about genre? Do you need to think, I am setting out to write something that adheres to these qualities of noir or these aspects of slipstream fiction, even something that maybe bridges genres? Do you think about genre at the outset, or is that something for you that materializes as you're writing? Does it materialize with the characters, or do the characters come from genre?
My process on that has really changed. Because even ask me 5 years ago, I would have said, no, I don't do that at all. Whatever genre emerges is whatever. But I've increasingly come to, well, actually, let me tell you a story as to how that changed. So I was in a writer's group, and I was writing mainly slipstreamy, magic realist kind of stuff that was kind of mixed genre, I guess. And at some point after, I was in that group for a long time, they'd critiqued maybe the, 20th story. And one of the more astute writers, who's also a very good editor, said to me, Randy, if you're always writing characters whose agency is compromised and their choices always lead to increasingly tragic consequences, and there's usually some kind of complete loss of agency or catastrophe at the end, and it's not really mediated by any upending at all. In other words, if you're always writing noir, why aren't you just writing noir? And a light bulb went off on my head, and I'm like, actually, that's true. That seems to be where my interests lie. So now I think about it more fully and more explicitly when I create the characters. So I have to, when I'm doing the character craft, I have to think more specifically about how their motives and how their desires, and for that matter, how their backstories will contribute to an arc that is, first of all, tragic, and secondly, has to do with their clear loss of agency in some way. I do think about it more fully now. And I'll think about it also when I revise. And it's kind of it's a background question it's always hovering when I'm, say, shifting maybe even a single scene or something like that.
That brings to mind something that Mike and I discussed with Megan on our last episode. She was talking about, specifically with poetry, how there are so many different types of poem, like containers that you can fit words into. Do you find, since you became more self-aware about working in noir, do you feel that you have more of a recipe to go by? Or, because Mike and I were talking, because Mike often writes, gothic and weird. And I thought, I was considering those to be constraints in a good way, I suppose. But he said he doesn't think of them as constraints, more generative. So I'm just curious, like you say that there's a shift in how you were writing, like how that would manifest.
I guess I'm with Mike on that one. I don't really think of it as constraints. I think of it more fully as I've found a set of formal characteristics that align more fully with what I'm interested in anyway. So it's not like I have to jam them or jam the craft or shoehorn it into a structure that, sets the limits. It's like I've found the structure. I've found the mold by which I can indulge my curiosities and interests most fully. Because, unless you're writing something 100% experimental, you always have some kind of structure or mold or set of formal characteristics, right? So I guess the question for me would always be, do those formal characteristics align with my worldview or my interests, or do they not?
And that makes sense in terms of why myself as a more emerging writer am asked, because I'm writing my first novel. I feel as if I'm free falling. I go back and forth on, do I want it to be gothic? If so, do I have to have, familial trauma or haunted house? And that feels like a constraint. But whereas you and Mike are further along, that's heartening to hear that it might just be something that aligns with your worldview. So thank you.
It's maybe partially a question, too, of how fully you want to consider your readers. Because if you look at, what's the book by Shawn Coyne? The story Grid, I think it is. And he's got this now kind of famous among writers idea of creating the obligatory scenes, right? And each genre will have obligatory scenes, no matter what you call them. I guess whether they feel obligatory or not might have something to do with how fully one is considering one's readers. And I don't know whether it's the best idea or not, but I'm not usually thinking of my readers. Not that I don't want readers, but usually if I'm really honest with myself, I'm like, what am I writing? I'm writing what I'd like to read. So maybe that, and Mike, you might share that with me. We just kind of, we're just doing the stuff we like.
Certainly. I think that is a case where I would feel that idea of constriction is if I start to think, what does this hypothetical person want out of what I'm writing? And I think as soon as I start to play that game, I start to second guess myself. I start to, in worst cases, stop myself. So if I think about, I want to write a novel exploring these topics or these feelings or these images that interest me, and then I veer toward, what does this hypothetical group of people expect of this set of ideas? That would feel constraining to me. So I feel for me, it's just, I happen to write things that often are grim, often kind of push against the boundaries of what is real, often deal in the supernatural, but it's not for any reason other than it's what comes out of my brain when I sit down at a keyboard. And, there are explanations for that. The explanations are, that I have read certain things and experienced certain things. So it's coming from someplace. But I do think a lot of these kind of structural things we talk about are unconscious. We're kind of downloading things that are already there. We probably have more of this kind of instinctively present in ourselves than we are even conscious sometimes. I guess this kind of dovetails a little bit, Randy. You were talking about structure and form. And I was just remembering when I did a directed writing/readings course with you in my undergraduate course, you walked me through an exercise that I think about a lot, which is, together we wrote down all the scenes that occurred in a rough draft of a short story I had written on index cards. And then we laid down all the index cards on this huge table in the department lobby. And something about seeing all the scenes laid out graphically that way, it helped illuminate not only which scenes are necessary, but also the order of the scenes. Something about visualizing a story graphically that way. There's something very intuitively interesting about that. So I guess I'm dovetailing to ask you about your own craft. Is that something you still do? Do you still use index cards? Is it important for you to see a story laid out graphically like that before you begin writing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't necessarily use I do use index cards too. But yeah, I was a huge, as you recall, I was a huge index card aficionado. Index cards and sticky notes. And I think the key for me and for many writers, I think especially professional writers of genre, is to have some kind of random access system whereby, there's one scene or one beat or one idea on a single card or whatever it is, and then you can shift them around, right? Yeah, I wouldn't be able to understand story at all without that kind of visual component to my process. And also, if I don't use that process where I force myself to, say, write the keys for, say, a single scene down on a single card, it gets too complicated. Like, it's one thing to not write for readers, but it's another thing to abandon them altogether, right? And with readers, if there's just too much complexity, because, I'm thinking about it from my end as the writer, and it's like, oh, I want this in there as well, and I want this shadowy motive, and I want these two motives to be at cross purposes, and it gets to be too much. I'm writing like whatever the literary equivalent of prog rock or fusion is, and who wants to read that, right? So these days I use what for me is a fabulous software called and by the way, I'm not plugging them, I guess, or am I don't know. I'm not getting paid, I'm not getting a kickback, but there's a software called Plotter, Plottr, and it kind of mimics the file cards in digital format. So rather than having to lug a big box of file cards and sticky notes around, I could just take my laptop or my iPad, and it's all in there. And what I like about it is, it has visually really what are a series of cards, and you can see them. You can zoom out and see them all at once, or you can zoom in and see a certain sequence of scenes or whatever. And then for each scene or each card, nested in it is a whole bunch of detail. So I can zoom in on a single scene, click on a button, and open up all my notes for it. So really what it does is it replaces reams of paper and cardboard. I find, for me anyway, one of the most helpful craft elements is to zoom in and out of scale. So if I can go from probably the smallest scale, which for me would be the beat, out to the largest scale, which would be the entire structure from start to finish, and everything in between, that's what helps me the most to manage, especially a longer piece of fiction. So I don't think it works for everyone, Plotter, but it really works well for me.
Mike and I use something similar. We also have no affiliation with it and are not plugging, but we use something individually, we use it, not together, called Scrivener. Same idea. You can move sticky notes, so to speak, around on a cork board and click in and look at the scenes. But I do have a question based on what you were talking about, because I'm always curious about how atomic to get with story. Could you define a beat? What's the difference between a scene and a beat? Is there a distinction?
Well, for me it is, but it depends on how you use beat, right? So if you look at, say, the Save the Cat system, I think a beat is defined as the set of, or one of the crucial set of scenes. So I think in Save the Cat, there's like 15 beats or something like that. The definition of beat that I use comes from method acting. And as I understand it, it's called beat because of the original Russian accent using the word bit. The beats. So for me, a bit, I would describe it the way Robert McKee describes it, as the minimal unit of interaction. So for example, two cops come up to the front door, they knock on the door, either somebody opens it or somebody doesn't open it or whatever. That's a beat. And so for me, the structure of a scene is completely dependent on the structure and ordering and choice of the beats. And once I really got a handle on that, it just got way easier. way easier, because I understood that a scene, from start to finish, or a sequence, or an entire act, or an entire, arc of a novel, they all have pretty much the same structure. It's fractal in that way. But really the granular or cellular level is the beats. Say I have a scene and I know what it has to do in the larger context of the overall arc, and I know where the scene has to start in terms of what the character wants, and I know where the scene has to end in terms of the character either gets what they want or don't, then I have to figure out the beats. And that's the fun part for me, because the beats are like music. Ideally, they have a crescendo to them. So in other words, the first beat will be the character not getting what they want, but in a fairly minimal way. And then the character has to change tactics for the next beat. And again, they don't get what they want, or at least not what they expected. And it builds. And usually what I do is I abandon the digital format for that sequence of plot or of craft details, and I just use sticky notes. And again, the sticky notes are good for me because they're random access, and I can look at the 8th beat and I say, actually, that 8th beat is less intense than the 5th. So I got to either replace them or revise which beats are going to work. And for that particular method, I find Robert McKee probably the most useful. And he's got a description of how to do that method in not his famous book Story, in his book on dialogue.
I did read Save the Cat, and it was helpful for the 15 beats. Especially helpful, I won't name anything, but when you're taking in a bad book or a bad movie, I find trying to get those beats, just identify them, is a way to keep yourself engaged. Is it fair to say that what you're talking about is kind of like reversals of fortune? Because I watch things like, I'm a fan of like The White Lotus. I think that Mike White is good at handling these reversals of fortune, which keep viewers or readers, if it's literature, on their toes. So that's how I've started to try to think about beats and try to have those arcs. Is that at all factor in to what you do?
Absolutely, yeah. And the term that I use for it, which I totally took from Robert McKee, is gap. So a gap for Robert McKee is some kind of disjunction between what a character expected and what actually happened. And it can be very minimal. It can be like, I have a cup of tea here. It can be, oh, this tea is delicious. I can't wait for the next sip. It's a little bit colder than I thought, so it doesn't quite taste as good. And it can also be extreme, right? It can also be I thought that you and I would end up together in this rom-com, and we didn't. Right? So whatever it is, minimal or maximum, there's this disjunction between what McKee would call the subjective realm, which is what one wants or what one expects, or to put it more technically, the consequence one expects will be produced by the choice and action one takes. And I think the reason it's so effective in narrative is, I think that's one place where narrative and everyday experience always overlap. Like, I think if we're honest with ourselves, the entire day, every day, except when we're sleeping, is filled with gaps. Like nothing, no consequence any of us ever produces is quite exactly the way we wanted it or expected it to be. And I think that experience is so deeply lodged in even maybe bodily memory. I don't want to go too woo here, but I think we're so familiar with it that there's a kind of identification, a reflex identification, when we see it happening over and over again in narrative. And so again, I mean, I'll have to I'll have to send McKee a card or something one day. No, I'm kidding. But he's been so useful to me because when I understood that, I understood that, okay, even the beats are gaps. So I think a classic example is the one I referred to earlier. Two detectives say, go to the door. They knock. If, somebody opens the door and they say, we'd like to ask you some questions. And the person goes, okay, come on in. That's a narrative fail, right? So even that single interaction, there has to be some disjunction. There has to be a gap. And once I understood that, it sort of lit up for me. It's like, oh, okay. So even at the cellular level of narrative, there's always tension. There's never a single moment when there's not tension. And for me, I think understanding that boils down to the answer to a specific question, which is the fundamental stuff of narrative language, or is it structure manifested in language? And I think people will disagree about this. Certainly there are books where I think maybe it is the language that carries the day, or it could be both, of course. Once I started to understand narrative, and especially beats, not in terms of language, but in terms of almost musical rhythms or structures, that really changed the way I write. And I think this will maybe sound strange, but I think I was telling Mike at some point in the past that I'll often write a scene now in point form. And for me, it works like magic because I don't get lost in the language. And I'm not really conceptualizing the rhythm and the crescendo of the scene in terms of language. But my view is the language is the easy part. That's the paint you put on at the end. And that maybe that's because we're English majors. It might not be the easy part for everybody, but I think probably for all three of us, it's the easy part, right?
Yeah, I remember the first time you used that example of the detectives knocking at the door. That was a big revelation to me. And I've noticed since I've taken that into account when writing, I do tend to hear more often, this kept me turning the pages if I'm thinking in terms of micro conflicts. There is never a kind of smooth transition from one beat to the next. There always has to be that turn, that reversal. It can just be even a hiccup, but even that hiccup creates tension, creates drama. So that has been really helpful for me to think about as a writer. Something I wanted to ask you is if there are specific fiction books that you would identify as being particularly good examples of craft. Like if someone said, I want to see an exemplar of well executed fiction on a formal level, what are some of the books that you would recommend?
Well, I would recommend anything by Agatha Christie if you're thinking of crime genre. I would also recommend the first, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 chapters of Rose Madder by Stephen King. Stephen King seems to have an innate genius when he's on for writing, the tension in the beats. I mean, if he's to be believed, he doesn't do it on purpose. Like he doesn't have an outline or anything, which always amazes me. I'm not sure if I believe it. But that is an exceptional set of chapters for me, in that every single tiny microcosmic beat has this scintillating tension in it. And I reread it frequently and just marvel at it, right down to the language. Sometimes it's even like a smaller unit than the beat. It's like embedded right in maybe in the syntax or the punctuation. And then I would also recommend, for me anyway, anything by Megan Abbott. She seems to have an excruciating in a good way, sense of the microtensions, and just able to milk it scene after scene after scene. Always amazes me and thrills me and delights me. I would really like to meet Megan Abbott and ask her what her process is. That'd be terrific.
I read You Will Know Me by Megan Abbott, and I really liked it. Is there a specific book of hers that you would especially recommend?
Well, my favorite is Queenpin, which is a fairly early one, and it's a very classic, almost nostalgic type of noir. But also, now I'm forgetting, not her last book, but her second last book, which is about a couple of ballet teachers, The Turnout. Anyway, that's a book where the minimal units of tension are so compressed that you don't even really find a scene that's longer than, maybe 200 words. So for me, it's like a masterclass in formal brilliance in terms of microtension.
Something you mentioned made me think of a perhaps somewhat unrelated question. You said, if Stephen King is to be believed, it's just interesting. We have all these myths about, I know that Shirley Jackson allegedly wrote The Lottery in 2 days, but then historians or scholars have sought to debunk that. But let's, I guess, demystify the artistic process here.
what is your process for writing? Like, do you write every day? Do you have a regimented writing schedule? And if so, what is it?
I have the worst autobiography for writing that you could ever pass on to young writers. I only write when I feel like it. So no, I don't have anything like, and never have had anything like a regimented schedule. I've never found that like writing for 1 hour a day or doing the 10 pages, I've never found that to be all that useful at all. The process that I've settled into is I just tinker with the overall structure for as long as it takes. And once that's ready, then I can usually write the actual language quite quickly. Not always, but usually quite quickly. And it's sort of a matter of, I have the blueprint and now I just get the materials and build it. Not to say that I don't do revisions, because I do. But for me, the process is mainly just here and there, whenever I'm in the mood, tinkering with structure. And as I said earlier, that always starts with character. And once I have that figured out, then I can move forward in terms of the decisions and the consequences, and the plot kind of fills itself out. But a lot of tinkering, a lot of sort of slow, methodical, crafty, rather than, fiery tinkering. And I often hear the cliche, write hot, edit cold. For me, it's plan cold, write cold, edit cold. So there's no point at which any of the writing process is ever hot for me. It's never caffeinated. It's never this sort of romantic image of, the writer pounding out the stuff almost faster than you can think. For me, it's always slow, always cold.
Yeah, because there is this romantic notion, I think, often propagated, debatably even a harmful notion, that writing should be this sort of fiery, passionate process. I don't know. And it's often associated with like the kind of temperamental genius archetype, which can cause all sorts of problems as well. But yeah, I think it's one of the kind of unromantic realities of writing is that more than anything, it's about work. It's about focus and discipline and kind of being able to lock into a cognitive space, and also the willingness to go over something again and again and again. I think a big part of what makes a book good is that sort of menial work, that the laborious part is often, those are the moments when you find the things that make a book really work. Although it's not a particularly edifying way to think about art sometimes in those terms as working or not working. Those can be weird terms, but that's often, I don't know, where you can find the book. And as you were just talking, I think I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you said you were working on Arctic Smoke for something like 10 years, right? I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about that. If that was a book you were working on continually for that period of time, or?
Yeah, it was very patchy, very asymmetrical. There were, days when I'd work for hours on it. There were months, maybe even years, when I really didn't look at it at all. And then there was a single year where I did a lot of revising almost every day. Yeah, there was no rhyme or reason to the process at all. And that particular book was kind of, I don't want to say accidental, but it wasn't very crafty in the first parts. I wasn't really thinking about where it was going or who the characters were. I wish I would have, but I wasn't. And I only kind of started doing that maybe in the last 5 years. So it was a weird process. And I think looking back on that particular novel, I think I was far too enchanted with language at that time. Now when I go back and edit the language, I frequently go back, and if something is too, I'll say, quote unquote, poetic, if something is too metaphoric, too maybe even interesting, I'll change it back to something less interesting. And I'll tell you the reason I do that is a lot of recent neuroscience suggests, it's so strange and I was taken aback, but it suggests that when a narrative is working in the brain, and the body too, I guess, in the embodied brain. And when it has a kind of momentum by which the reader is engaged and there is identification, there's empathy, there's suspense because of the identification and empathy, it actually is true, as many genre readers have always said, that too much language takes you out of the story. So they actually actively interfere with each other, those two cognitive processes. That's not to say, there aren't readers who love a poetic narrative. Of course there are. For the most part, and all other things being equal, you have to calibrate the balance between those two things very carefully. And so my balance, I think, was way off. And I'm trying to address that. It's difficult. but it's an interesting sort of recent feature of my own craft.
As you were just talking, I was thinking about a novel that we discussed within the last couple years, which is Thomas Harris's Red Dragon, a novel that I think for me, it's such an exemplar of concision and of a kind of economy of language and this distillation of the narrative principles that we're talking about, that notion of rhythm and of tension at the level of the sentence.
When I'm reading it, it feels like the language is uniformly gorgeous and interesting and sizzling. But then if you take a chunk of it and look at it very closely, he seems to have this genius for just dropping it in here and there. By it, I mean, something interesting in terms of language. Once in a while, he'll do a little bit of a tense shift from past to present, but it's minimal. It's almost like a seasoned musician dropping in something interesting in a solo, but not too much. Not so it's overwhelming. Not so it becomes a guitar solo by Yngwie Malmsteen, if anyone gets that reference. So I find in Harrison a sort of exemplary example. I think that's from the Department of Redundancy department. Anyway, an example. I find in that an example of that neuroscience that's currently interesting to me.
That's interesting. And I do agree with you, Randy. Sometimes when I read things that are very beautiful, but very poetic, I liken it to different types of chocolate. Like 98% cocoa is how I feel, i.e., great, but tastes a little bit like dirt sometimes. Different types of craft books try to address that very atomic kind of at the level of language and sentence construction itself. I believe you also read The Attack of the Copula Spiders by Douglas Glover, in which he talks about the drama of grammar, juxtapositions like using but, yet, although. Right now I'm reading Consider This by Chuck Palahniuk, a book on craft, and he talks about modulating POV. If you're writing, especially in first person, try to mix it up, try to use a little bit of second person and third person in the grammar itself to keep the brain engaged. So do you have any concrete tips that you've come across for how to do that at the sentence or language level to keep the reader engaged on a neuroscientific level?
I loved Attack of the Copula Spiders, and I should thank you for that referral. For me, it seems to add like another set of tools to the toolkit, in that after one figures out the beats, or I guess I put it after one figures out all the rhythmic structure, one can actually go even deeper and create a little bit of extra tension in the grammar itself. And the one thing that I'll never forget from Attack of the Copula Spiders is just the power of but, the conjunction but. If you're an English speaker and you've heard but so many times, and it probably always has a particular affect to it, very, very minimal, maybe even below the threshold of consciousness. But there's always that slight tension, right? But, meaning, except. And it seems, to my mind anyway, it seems to mimic in the grammatical construction the gap, right? Well, I wanted to have supper at 5, but. And I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I suspect that if one experiences that over and over and over again in life, every time you or someone else says but, probably carries a sort of a minimal charge that you can then piggyback on in your own writing. It's an area of writing that I'm just starting to explore, and it's fascinating to me.
Mike and I watch not a lot, but I like reality TV. There's a lot of I'm sorry, but, because these people are poor communicators, which is interesting on a character level because it's not a real apology.
I was thinking the same thing as Randy was talking about the conjunction, but you see a lot of that in a show like Vanderpump Rules, where a lot of the tension actually is encoded in language, because so much of it is very banal. It's about the impropriety of neglecting to invite someone to a certain party, just these really asinine conflicts, but the tension is often just there in the way they communicate. That's where the drama occurs. I reread your piece as we were preparing for this episode from the Montreal Review called The Life and Death of 12-Year-Old Boys. I just wanted to read an excerpt from that. Quote, "It is a truism to note that memory is unreliable, but more, memories are elastic, spastic, fractal, jammed, porous. Neuroscience tells us so. They imply lines of fixed time and chronology, but they are also horizontal, like giant weavings that sprawl with entanglements of every hue. Or perhaps a better metaphor is the ancient cliché of water, the dynamic of stillness and motion that can be shallow or deep, flowing or pooling. Water is difficult to map, especially when it is turbulent, but it always changes the landscape. Like memory, water is never finished." how does memory play into your own writing practice? How do you approach writing memory? Do you have anything to say about the role of memory in fiction writing? As someone interested in Gothic, I'm interested in how past maps onto present. Rose Madder would be a good example of that, but also the role of memory in writing oneself. So there's memory required, I guess, in terms of plotting, even in terms of the psychology or emotion of writing.
The Life and Death of 12-Year-Old Boys was actually my first stab at autofiction. And I'm not sure I completely, understand at a fine-grained level what autofiction means in Europe, where until recently it was much more popular. I was interested in taking a stab at it when I recently ran into a weird historical disjunction, speaking of gaps. So I grew up in a Mennonite Brethren culture, so-called Russian Mennonite, and we have this kind of folk narrative, this folk memory encoded in narrative, that there was this demonic presence named Maknau, who raped, pillaged, killed, destroyed, revenged our people around 1919 in Ukraine during that moment when, there was basically anarchy in Ukraine. So the name Maknau and just the sort of concept and term anarchy hold a potent folk memory among my clan, and I always kind of unzipped into very simple narratives like he destroyed our people, blah, blah, blah. So I had that downloaded, and I sort of forgot about Maknau as an adult. And then one day I ran into a description of Maknau in terms of Ukrainian narrative, right? So from the other side. And one of the circulating narratives in Ukraine is that Maknau was the Ukrainian Robin Hood. I was like, whoa, they're at a collective cultural level is a fascinating example of how competing narratives wrestle with the idea of memory. And so I wondered immediately, well, what are the actual historical facts? And they're hard to ascertain, right? But I wanted to kind of play with the idea that when facts, if I can use that term, when facts are encoded, taken up, encoded, and organized in narrative, I'm not sure they're facts anymore. And if you put that together with the claim, which I do believe, that we as humans, we mainly process information and we mainly remember information in the narrative form, that's a problem, right? And it's a problem, but it also has a lot of explanatory power in terms of current politics in Alberta, where I live, or in America, where Trump lives, or in Poland, Hungary, Russia, on and on. I'm very interested in and disturbed by the relationship between memory and narrative when you think of narrative as the primary mode by which memory functions, either individually or collectively. Now, whether one can drive that set of ideas into a story itself, I'm sure you can, but I haven't really wrestled with that yet.
That's interesting. And this isn't a question so much as a remark. I was looking at Crooked Timber. In your foreword, you have kind of a Mother Goose figure, Mother Goose being this non-entity from which all, like folklore or fairy tale as we know it springs. It was Tante
Zeus.
Cool. That's right, Tante Zeus.
We have this joke that everyone in the Mennonite Brethren clan has a Tante Zeus, which roughly translates as Auntie Suze or Auntie Susan.
Is that a fixation of yours? I mean, Mike and I always talk about, we love recurring fixations. We both have them. I think most writers have them. Is that something that really interests you? This kind of mythical quality of story? Or do you have any kind of things that you find yourself coming back to?
Absolutely, yeah. I love that feel, that affect of a story that's so old, it's kind of lost its original sensibility. And yet, somewhere in there is lodged a particular kind of affect or feel or mood or tone. Oh, it's hard to describe, right? It's still there, but you don't know what it is, right? You can't really unzip it into a linguistic description. Whether that kind of thing is quote unquote mythic, I don't know. I guess people would argue about that. But whatever it is, and whether it's real or not, I love it, which is one of the reasons why I love reading the Old Testament. What a set of insane stories. And it seems so clear to me that, say you're going from, I don't know, verse 6 to verse 8 in Leviticus. I don't know. I don't have a Bible verse off the top of my head here. But you go and it's suddenly clear to me that somehow two stories from two different times with two different purposes and maybe even from two different people got jammed together. And there's a charge to each of them, but the charge is different. And somehow they're jammed together and, it's ostensibly it's the same God, except it really isn't. And I don't know, there's a frisson there, probably for both of you too, by the sounds of it, that I'm constantly trying to hit in my own writing. But how you do it, I don't know. That kind of thing is almost beyond craft. I mean, then we're into the realm of dreams and hallucinations and weird non-linguistic feels and affects and that kind of juicy, delicious stuff. Maybe we're into the realm of poetry. I'm not sure.
Well, we're certainly within the realm of mythology, I guess, which has aspects of dream and poetry. As you were just talking about the Christian mythology in the Old Testament, I was thinking about a novella that I have been working on that I passed along to Miriam, and she said, "Oh, this is a lot like the myth of Prometheus," which I hadn't even been conscious of while writing it. But there were all these sort of echoes that were showing up in the novella that I wasn't conscious of at all, but maybe on some deeply unconscious level were presenting themselves. Do you ever use specific mythological structures or templates to work with us? I know it's something Miriam has done as well. She wrote a piece recently that deals with the Gorgon myth. Is that something you do as well, Randy? Do you ever turn to myth as a kind of template or a map or a model?
All the time. I don't know if a template, if you mean by template, a set of sequences that drive toward a particular conclusion. I probably do that unconsciously. I'm not sure if I do that explicitly. But yeah, I'm always searching for, I don't know what to call it, the mood or the feel, the affect, I guess, within certain mythological types or structures. So for example, I'm always, whether it's a scene or an overall arc, I'm always looking for some kind of night journey, some kind of Orpheus descending. I'm always looking for, say, the feel of the original Edenic myth or Cain and Abel. I mean, it's just so much so much juicy stuff there to rob, right? And I have this view, I mean, I don't know if it's demonstrable empirically, but I have this view that certain kinds of affect and feel do get passed on from generation to generation. How that happens scientifically and anthropologically, I'm not exactly sure. But I'm pretty sure that the more something happens, the more it continues to happen, even if it's not something that's perfectly explicable in language or some other system of formal representation. I think it does happen. So whether or not those original tales or those original feels are real or appropriate, I don't know, it just seems to me that you can kind of riff on that magic and on that mood. And I'll give you a quick example. I was just trying to think of a particular scene today for a new novel I'm writing. And suddenly it opened up for me when I thought of Jadis from The Magician's Nephew. You've read that, I know, Mike. So remember when Diggory and Jadis have their final encounter in the apple garden? And it's a restaging of the Edenic myth, right? And there's all those terrific images of Jadis's mouth all, I mean, I hope I'm not trading on misogynistic myths here, but there's just something like, there's a chill and a shiver there. So I'm like, well, how do I capture that? What can I steal there? And there's this fabulous simile in The Magician's Nephew, and I can't remember if it's that scene or not, but where Lewis describes Jadis' skin as white as salt. I mean, you get the first layer of metaphor or simile there, but you also got that faint resonance of Lot's wife, right? So I almost think of these things as, I'm going to coin something here, and I'm not sure if it'll work, but I think of these things as affective zip files. It's like somehow historically there's this potent charge that you can put in this compressed file, and then when a reader hits it, if they have the right references, it just opens up this affect which otherwise wouldn't be there. Obviously, I haven't really thought about this in any well theorized way, but I'm always searching for that.
Growing up, I had D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myths. I just had certain books that were around me as a child that definitely influenced me more than anything else, which a bit of a segue, but I'm curious, when you started to write, were there any influences that really guided you through that? And if so, do you find that you still have a strong sense of influence, or that kind of falls aside as you become more confident in your voice?
Yeah, for sure. When I started writing, I was obsessed with William Gibson's Neuromancer. And I not only read everything I could get by Gibson he had written to that point, but also, I was reading interviews with Gibson, and he mentioned Pynchon, Thomas Pynchon, and, the noir and hard-boiled tradition. So I was obsessively reading all of that stuff. That's probably why I got over-interested in the language, because as has been remarked many times about both Neuromancer and Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon, there's so much language, it's exhausting to read. Like the narrative does suffer. So I was really interested in that stuff. And I became really interested in the whole noir tradition. And I was also reading another book by a writer named Mark Helprin, who's also a really language-rich writer, called Winter's Tale. It's kind of an urban fantasy set in New York. So all of those books, I think, really caused me to drift a little too fully into like a supercharged interest in language, though I did not become interested in poetry for whatever reason. So I still count those among my influences, but lately I'm much more likely to say that my current influences are noir writers, like Megan Abbott, for sure. And probably Dorothy B. Hughes would be my other signal influence at this point. And I'm not so much reading them for their language, though their language is tremendous, but for how they manage those beats, those microtensions that we were talking about earlier, and how they manage stories that never end well, how those characters are created, how they function, how they choose, what actions they take, what kinds of consequences they produce. I'm the classic magpie. I'll look at anything and everything. And if I'm stuck, I'll just read the Old Testament. There's always something there. What a crazy, crazy set of tales. And so violent. Just dreadfully violent.
Talk about weird horror. Look no further than the Old Testament. What aspect of the process do you struggle with the most? I tend to struggle with very mechanical things like, how do I move from one scene to the next? How do I geographically shift scenes without boring the reader? Sometimes mechanical things like that can present difficulty to me.
Yeah, that's actually a very easy question for me, and it's always the same. The most difficult thing for me is plot holes, and especially the longer the narrative gets, right? So even though I'm writing from the character outward, which tends to help a lot, I find, especially once you get around 60, 70, 80,000 words, it's pretty hard not to create some plot holes, especially consequences that don't make sense, or reveals that happen too early, or reveals that don't make sense. So managing the reversal and the reveal and all that plotting information that arises out of character choices, that's always the hardest part for me. And I have this fantasy that I'll somehow, someday, get it right at the planning stage, so I don't have to ever think about it again. But it hasn't happened so far. Either I'll find them or a beta reader will find them, and then it's literally back to the drawing board. For whatever reason, that's a difficult one for me.
I can empathize with that. I've been listening to lots of interviews with Gillian Flynn recently. She talks a lot about wrong-footing the reader and how if you're going to wrong-foot the reader, you have to do it right or else it's kind of a bust. So reveals are quite hard.
Yeah, Flynn is an amazing writer, on that score. I'm always kind of in awe of her skill there, and I'd like to know how she does it. I mean, I have books on it, written by mystery writers especially, but I haven't mastered it yet. I don't suspect I ever will, to be honest.
How do you know when you're finished writing something, when it's time to submit to a publisher, to submit to first readers or whatever?
I mean, on one level, especially if I'm thinking about language, the kind of nuts and bolts, it's never finished. But on another level, when I'm thinking of overall structure, and this will sound really genre-y, when the inciting incident and the climax click, when they click together, then I know it's done. Or not done, maybe, but then I know it's as done as it can get. And then it's just a matter of filling out the in-between. But for me, that's, as the cliche often goes, that's the difficult thing, the ending. Endings are hard. And if an ending doesn't work in a deeply connected way with the beginning, I mean, you don't have a standard or classic narrative anyway. But getting those two things to work together in a way, as the cliche goes, that is both surprising and inevitable. Once I hit that, then I feel like most of the difficult work is done. And sometimes I just don't hit it, and eventually I will abandon those stories. It's got to be surprising and inevitable.
Would you say that that's a matter of theme to get that resonance between the two? Or would you call it something else?
I know some writers would say that. I don't tend to think of theme ever. For my money, did I just say that? In my view, if a writer is halfway good and a halfway interesting person, the theme will arise. Now, I know much more accomplished writers than myself who would disagree with that. I know writers who actually start with theme. But for me, the click between the conclusion and the beginning, between the inciting incident and the climax, is always a matter of character. It's got that feel of surprising yet inevitable, both for that character and for the reader when they are thinking about what would have happened to that character or where that character would have ended up. Man, it's devilishly hard to do, at least for me. And it comes down to really crafting the character.
That is very sage advice. I'm going to seriously consider this in my novel that I'm currently writing. And you're right, it does make sense as a matter of character. I do think that theme is the cream that rises to the top.
I think it'd be hard to write a narrative that's formally successful and yet didn't have a theme. That seems to me something that would be impossible to do. Like you would have to work hard not to have a theme. And the other thing I'd add to that is, I don't want to cite neuroscience the way that some folks do, the kind of slinging around neuro junk, I think they sometimes call it. But there is some compelling evidence, at least in my experience, neuroscientific evidence, that what people are primarily engaged with in narrative is characters, right? For example, why do we have such an interest in gossip? We're interested to see how people manage certain problems, right? What kind of choices do they make? What kind of consequences are produced by those choices? And then what do they do after they see their consequences? It seems to be I don't want to throw around the word universal, but it seems to be a very common interest. There's a book by Lisa Cron. I can't remember the title. It's ostensibly a neuroscientific book. Your mileage may vary on that, but that is the key claim that drives that book. We are inescapably curious, not only as readers, but just as people, in what's going on behind the eyes. Another writer who's much more technical, a narratologist named Lisa Sunshine, her claim is that we respond to narrative because we're always obsessively wired to wonder about theory of mind. So when somebody does something, what was really going on inside? What were they thinking? What were their motives? And, whether her theory about that is correct, it seems a little too evolutionary for my taste. But there's something interesting there, right? If we do come into this world already sort of pre-wired with the potential to always worry about what someone's actual motives are and what the thoughts are behind the actions and the behaviors, then we also seem to be pre-wired to be interested in characters as a kind of virtualized environment where that happens and those mental proclivities can sort of run free. So that's my plug for character craft, or one of my plugs.
Have you read anything recently that has really excited you?
Actually, recently I've gone on a bender. I go on this bender frequently, actually. James Lee Burke. So James Lee Burke's Dave Robicheaux series, and there must be maybe 30 of those titles now. And in a way, they're all the same. It's not a character that develops. But Dave Robicheaux is this conflicted Vietnam vet down in New Orleans who is sometimes he works for a police force, sometimes he's a private investigator, sometimes he's neither. But speaking of myth and mythic resonance, and for that matter, Old Testament, and speaking of language and voice, I find those books so powerful. This will sound funny, but the plot doesn't matter. I'm not even sure those books always have an arc, which is a weird thing to say. There's something else going on there. There's something that James Lee Burke can do with character that dazzles and amazes me, and I don't understand it. Because I'll finish a Dave Robicheaux mystery. I'm not even sure what happened. I'm not even completely sure whether there was a climax or an inciting incident, let alone any traditional kind of rising action. And yet there's just this lingering power and this lingering sense of maybe an almost supernatural evil alive and afoot in that world. And it just, I don't know, it scintillates me. So there's a reason he's a widely celebrated writer. And the other one I was recently on a JAG bender with was Dennis Lehane, a marvelous crime writer. And I think actually oddly enough, James Lee Burke himself said that Mystic River is probably the best crime novel I've ever written in English. And by the way, the film is great too, right? Clint Eastwood directed. I'll always say anything by Megan Abbott. She is so good.
Yeah, sometimes I think Mystic River is my favorite Eastwood directed movie. It's definitely up there, top 5 maybe. Thank you so much, Randy. This has been a fascinating, riveting conversation. I will tell everyone listening to look up Randy's work. Make sure you read Crooked Timber. Make sure you read Arctic Smoke and anything and everything that comes out in the future. He's a brilliant, completely singular writer, also a very talented musician. So seek out Randy's creative work in all its various forms.